At 42, I was the guy people said, he's got it all. My house on the coast of Malibu towered over the ocean like a beacon of glass and concrete, reflecting the sunset colors. The garage held a collection of rare cars, each a work of art. A helicopter, a private jet, a 100-foot yacht. All of these seemed integral attributes of my life. Money had long ceased to be an end in itself. It was a tool that opened any door. But even in this picture of a perfect life, there was a small shadow that I tried to ignore at the time. My name was Michael Henderson, and I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma. My mother was a nurse. My father was a mechanic. We were not poor, but life was far from luxurious. My path to success began with the fact that I learned to turn problems into opportunities. I was one of those people who, having suffered defeat, fell only to get up even stronger. When I founded my first company at 26, I had no idea it would grow into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Luck, persistence, and a willingness to take risks got me to the top. But fame and fortune were not the anchors that could hold my soul. Despite the constant praise, I often felt a strange emptiness, as if victories were losing their flavor. My mornings began with coffee on the terrace, but instead of enjoying the view of the endless ocean, I often felt a strange melancholy within me. Money could do many things, but it could not give me what I myself did not understand. My wife Lisa was part of my success. We met when I had not yet achieved anything, and she believed in me from the very beginning. Her smile was always a source of inspiration for me. Lisa loved art and nature. She was a woman who could find beauty in the simplest things. But over the years, I noticed how an invisible wall was growing between us. Lisa increasingly withdrew into herself, and I justified my absence from home with work. The turning point came unexpectedly. It was an ordinary Tuesday, and I was preparing for a meeting with a major investor. Suddenly, my secretary burst into my office with a worried expression. Her words were like a bolt from the blue. Lisa had been in an accident. Her car had flipped on a narrow road in the mountains. She survived, but was seriously injured. I rushed to the hospital, ignoring the red traffic lights. At that moment, money and status ceased to matter. Seeing Lisa on a hospital bed, covered in bandages and hooked up to machines, I felt something inside me collapse. I was ready to give everything just to get her health back. The doctors said she would recover, but her road to recovery would be long and painful. My days turned into chaos. On one hand, I was trying to continue running the business. On the other, I was spending hours by Lisa's bed. My internal tension reached its limit. One day, I noticed a tired, drawn-faced man staring back at me in the mirror. It was me. That was the first time I realized that I might have lost something more valuable than money. Myself. One evening, when I got home, I opened the liquor cabinet. My hand reached for a bottle of whiskey. I poured myself a shot to relieve the tension, but instead of relief, I felt only emptiness. In that moment, I realized that behind the facade of a successful life was a person I no longer recognized. Lisa was suffering physically, and I was suffering mentally. It was as if our worlds had shattered into pieces. And yet, despite all the darkness, I did not give up. Deep down, I knew that I could not afford to fall. For Lisa, for myself, for that boy from Oklahoma who once dreamed of greatness. But I did not yet know how difficult this path would be. After Lisa's accident, I quickly realized that my life had been built on false foundations. My strength and independence, which I had always been so proud of, were an illusion. Every day was a challenge. Lisa was struggling with pain, going through surgeries and rehabilitation, and I felt helpless. My attempts to support her were awkward and clumsy. We lived in the same house, but we were like two strangers, each suffering in our own way. The work that had once brought me joy and a sense of control was now a source of constant stress. While I spent time in the hospital or at home with Lisa, things began to fall apart. My company's stock plummeted after a scandal involving one of my top managers. The media was out for blood, and my name was in every headline. The reputation I had built over decades was falling apart. I knew I had to act, but I couldn't focus. My mind was consumed with fears for Lisa and the guilt of allowing all this to happen. Lisa's recovery was slow. Her face and body were covered in scars that reminded me of how close we had come to the edge. One day, I saw her looking at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were full of pain and some kind of silent reproach. I wanted to go up to her and hug her, tell her that she was still beautiful, that I would always be there. But I stood in the doorway, not knowing how to find the right words. This moment haunted me at night. Day after day, I tried to combine work and caring for Lisa. But despite all my efforts, things were getting worse. My board of directors began to openly doubt my ability to run the company. They were right. I had lost the grip that I once considered my greatest asset. At one of the meetings, they told me to my face that the shareholders were demanding that I resign as CEO. My ego did not allow me to agree right away, but I understood that resistance was useless. I signed my resignation papers in my office, where I had once celebrated my greatest victories. When it was all over, I sat in silence, unsure of where to go. It felt like the end of a chapter one didn't want to close. The world I had created was crumbling before my eyes. I had lost the company that had become my baby, and now I was just an ordinary millionaire without a goal. It sounds funny, but that's how I felt: empty, useless. At this time, I began to notice how loneliness was filling everything around me. The friends I spent time with at parties and in expensive restaurants began to disappear. They weren't interested in my decline. Perhaps they were afraid of being infected with my problems. Or, more likely, I simply wasn't interesting to them anymore. All these people I laughed and drank champagne with turned out to be just scenery in a performance called success. I didn't know how to cope with this pain. My pride prevented me from seeking help, even from Lisa. Her condition was improving, but there was still an invisible wall between us. She spent a lot of time in the garden we had planted near our house. I watched her from the window, amazed at her strength. Unlike me, she was struggling with real pain and kept moving forward. I was ashamed to admit that my pain was more internal, but I felt weaker than her. One day, trying to somehow distract myself, I decided to clean out my office. I leafed through old photographs and documents, remembering what I was like 10, 20 years ago. In a box of papers, I came across a letter from my father. It was written long before he died and began with the words, "Michael, I am proud of you." I read these lines, feeling how something inside me changed. My father, a man who worked as a mechanic all his life, was proud of me even when I was not yet rich. His words made me think, who would I be if he saw me now? Would he appreciate my successes or notice the emptiness behind them? That night I fell asleep with a feeling that something in my life had to change. I could no longer live in anticipation of things getting better. I knew I had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a tiny spark of hope. The next day, I woke up early as the first rays of sunlight painted the ocean in golden tones. For the first time in a long time, I felt not broken, but ready to take action. All I had left was time, money, and a choice about how to spend it. I decided to start small, with what I could control. My house, once a symbol of success, now seemed too big, cold, and empty. I realized that I had been looking at it not with pride for a long time, but with a feeling of isolation. I contacted a realtor and put the mansion up for sale. The decision was not an easy one. This house was my refuge, a place where I spent so many memorable moments, but I knew I couldn't move forward while clinging to the past. Lisa took the news calmly, even with mild approval. Her silent agreement was a signal to me that she was ready for a change, too. We moved to a more modest but cozy house in Santa Barbara, surrounded by gardens. Lisa seemed to come alive among the greenery. She spent hours outdoors, tending to the flowers. Her movements became more confident, and her smile returned, although still shy. I felt that our connection was gradually being restored, but I knew this was not enough. I began to look for meaning outside the usual framework. My therapist, whom I finally decided to visit, helped me realize one simple truth. All my achievements were directed at the external world, but I had never built anything inside myself. These words became a starting point for me. I decided to use my time and money not to prove something, but to create something valuable. The first step was volunteering. I found a charity that supported families affected by accidents. It seemed right to me to invest my efforts there. At first, I donated a large sum, but quickly realized that money is only half the battle. I began to personally participate in projects, meet people, listen to their stories. These meetings filled me with new meaning. I saw how my help, even the smallest, changed someone's life, and for the first time in many years I felt useful. But despite this, the shadow of the past still did not leave me. I could not forget the company that I had built and lost. My former partners continued to run it, but without me, it was losing ground. I followed the news closely and, to my surprise, did not feel anger. Instead, I felt something akin to gratitude. This was a lesson I had to learn. Even great achievements do not guarantee happiness if you do not know what you are doing it for. A few months later, I received a letter from one of the families I helped. They thanked me for paying for their son's treatment after an accident. Attached were photographs of a smiling boy with medical equipment around him. His parents wrote that my help had given them hope when they were ready to give up. That letter touched me deeply. I realized that these moments, these connections with people, meant more than all the awards and titles I had ever received. Meanwhile, Lisa was slowly returning to a full life. We spent more time together, often walking along the beach, watching the sun set over the horizon. She didn't say much, but her gaze said everything. In her eyes, I saw not only gratitude, but something else, a respect I hadn't seen in a long time. Maybe she saw that I was finally changing, but the road to full recovery was far from over. At times, I still felt the weight of the past, wondering if I was doing the right thing, if I was doing enough. There were days when I felt useless, as if everything I did was not enough. But every time these feelings arose, I reminded myself that the path consists of small steps, not one spurt. I also began to think about how to help not only others, but myself as well. I took up sports, jogging on the beach, meditation. This was new for me, to devote time to inner peace rather than external achievements. Every evening, I wrote down 3 things I was grateful for in a journal. At first it was difficult, but over time I began to notice more positive moments even in the most simple of days. I felt that despite pain and loss, life can still be filled with light. A year after the accident and all the events that followed, I no longer recognized the person I had been before. Broken by life's blows, I began to slowly but surely rebuild myself. My life changed beyond recognition. Instead of an imaginary race for success, I began to focus on what brings real joy. One of the most significant changes was our new home. Lisa and I transformed it into a place that was not only pleasing to the eye, but also felt cozy. Simple wooden furniture, books on the shelves that we read together, paintings that she began to paint herself during the recovery process. The garden around the house became her favorite project, and I often helped her, even if it meant my hands were in the dirt and grass. I felt alive like never before. Meanwhile, my charity work began to turn into something more. I started a foundation that helped people who had experienced traumatic events return to a full life. We did not just pay out money, but also created support programs, provided psychological help, rehabilitation. This was my way of not only giving back to the world what I had taken, but also leaving behind something meaningful. The work of the foundation became a new challenge for me, but this time I felt that it was something I was ready to fight for. Lisa also found her place in this project. She conducted art therapy classes for those going through difficult times. Her energy, her light inspired me every day. Our relationship became deeper than ever before. We no longer lived in parallel worlds, but shared one, common one. Everything that happened to us only strengthened our connection. We learned to support each other, not with words, but with actions, small gestures, care. My inner journey also continued. I began to devote more time to myself. I read books on philosophy, reflected on the meaning of life. One of the most important thoughts I learned was the idea that happiness is not the final destination, but a way of perceiving the path. Everything I experienced, the fall, the loss, the pain, became not a punishment, but a lesson. It opened my eyes to what is important. But life, as always, was not without surprises. One day I received a call from the company I founded. The new CEO had decided to leave, and the board of directors wanted me to return. It was unexpected, even strange. I thought long and hard about whether to return to the life I had so desperately tried to escape. But this time, I felt different. When I arrived at the office, people greeted me differently than before. I saw not just respect in their eyes, but also curiosity. I told the board that I was ready to return, but only on new terms. The company would no longer chase imaginary records. We would focus on sustainability, on people, and not just on profit. My offer was accepted with cautious enthusiasm. I felt that this was not just a new chapter for the company, but also for me. Over time, I found a balance between the business, the foundation, and my personal life. My schedule was no longer filled to the brim as before. I had time to watch the sunset with Lisa, read a book on the terrace, or just walk along the beach. I was no longer the kind of person who measured his worth through success. Now I saw meaning in living consciously, being grateful for each day. One of the most memorable moments was Lisa and I deciding to go on a road trip around the country. We drove without a plan, stopped in small towns, enjoyed the simplicity of life. On one of these trips, I suddenly realized that I no longer looked back on the past with regret. Everything that had happened made me who I became. And most importantly, I learned to enjoy life again. At some point, I caught myself thinking that for the first time in many years, I could call myself happy. Not because I have everything, but because I learned to appreciate what I have. My life became simpler, but richer. I didn't know what awaited me next, but it no longer scared me. I was ready for anything, because I finally understood that the meaning of life is not to control it, but to live it.